As approximately 130,000 Russian troops appear poised to invade Ukraine, flanked by maneuvers on sea and in the air, NATO member states are divided as to how to respond to this threat. To analyze Vladimir Putin's intentions and whether the West still has the will and the capacity to deter Russia, we have the honor of welcoming former Estonian President Toomas Ilves, the noted geostrategic analyst, here to Hudson Institute for a conversation about policy options on the eve of what may well be a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Toomas Ilves, of course, needs no introduction. He is a forthright and transformative leader who served as Estonia's fourth president from 2006 to 2016. He was especially critical to Estonia's transformation into a global digital and cyber powerhouse, a remarkable feat for a country of 1.325 million people, just slightly smaller in population than our state of Maine. And his expertise at the intersection of technology, policy, and geostrategy, which I would argue is arguably unique among world leaders, were critical to his efforts at turning Estonia into a model for e-governance, but also more importantly, allowed Ilves to play a critical role on efforts at global internet governance and the like. Raised in exile from Estonia, primarily in the United States, educated at Columbia University and the University of Pennsylvania, Ilves, of course, is a hero of the movement to free captive nation Estonia, working as a journalist first and then as head of the Estonian Service of Radio for Europe from 1988 to 1993. From 1993 to 1996, he served as Estonian ambassador to the United States. A social democrat, he served twice as Estonian foreign minister from 1996 to 1998 and 1999 to 2002, and he was also a member of the European Parliament. I am delighted to welcome you to Hudson Institute. Look forward to your remarks, Mr. President.
Well, thank you very much, Ken. And well, last time I spoke to the Hudson Institute, it was, I guess, 2016, but then I was there in person.
Exactly.
So I'll just go through what I see from here. I mean, as you mentioned, there are 130,000 troops roughly. Equally important are massive amounts of materiel from all over Russia, and they are on almost all sides of Ukraine. So in the north, you have troops massed and tanks and all kinds of other things, both in Russia and to Russia's west on the border of Belarus and Ukraine. You have the eastern part of Ukraine is controlled by Russia in these satrapies of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, which were basically they're occupied by the Russian army, but this was kind of a result of the invasion of 2014. In the south, you have Crimea, which has been occupied again since 2014. On top of that, you have a large number of assault landing ships. The big fear is that they will be used to attack Odessa, which is one of Ukraine's most important culturally and population-wise important cities, main port other than in Crimea. And then even on the west, Transnistria, which is divided part of the divided Moldova, which is where Russian troops never left after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, this really comes down to these ultimata or ultimata, which were given by Russia right before Christmas, in which they demanded all kinds of things that really, I think, sent everyone into a shock. I mean, it started with Lavrov saying that Eastern Europe, after the collapse of communism, was, quote, left without masters. That is, and that this is one reason they're doing this, right? That's indicative of an attitude that has been running through all of their statements, which basically comes down to a restoration of spheres of influence. Their initial demand, which I guess we've heard a lot about and a lot of discussion in the US and elsewhere, is that NATO can't take in Ukraine, but there's no chance of Ukraine coming into NATO for years and years. But on the other hand, the North Atlantic Treaty, which is the basis for the existence of NATO, would have to be revised to meet these Russian demands, even if we thought about meeting them. And the Russians full well know that this would never happen, since a change in the treaty requires ratification by all 30 members, and that ain't going to happen. On top of that, they demand that NATO return to the situation in May 1997, which was before the enlargement of NATO, so there wouldn't be any NATO presence in any of the countries that have come into NATO in the past 25 years. So, and then on top of that, again today, Lavrov repeated his threat that, quote, if we do not receive a constructive answer from the West on our security demands, Moscow will take appropriate measures. So it's quite heated. And given everything, since we know that, the West, NATO will not go and meet these demands. There's no way, they've been told, but the Russians are demanding written answers. But the Russians know full well these can't be met. So basically, the conclusion is that they're spoiling for a fight. And this is what has everyone worried. So on the one hand, you have, they're surrounding Ukraine. Ukraine is basically hostage to this. And on the ground in Ukraine, well, the situation is very difficult to predict, and there are a number of scenarios are possible. But the consensus is that, on the one hand, the Ukrainians would lose if there were a war because of the massive, technological advantage of the Russians. Ukraine has an army of 145,000, so more or less about as many as Russian troops are gathered at least this moment. But they also have 300,000 to 400,000 veterans with combat experience who have been, for the past 8 years, been fighting the Russians at the border of the so-called Donbass. They have combat experience. They would offer significant resistance, even if outgunned by Russian forces with far superior air force and navy. On top of that, which I think makes the situation even more complex, is that the last 8 years has seen a complete change in Ukraine, which was kind of like a laggard country that with high corruption and low trust in the government. But the crucible of war, as we have seen over the years in many places, has really created a new Ukrainian identity that really, where the population believes in their country and do not want to, as they keep saying, we will not give up our freedom. And so you can see there are massive outpourings of people who, even 60-year-old grandmothers who joined the equivalent of a National Guard, running around in combat gear, sort of all practicing to defend their country. And so the opposition is going to be much larger than simple troop numbers show. On the Russian side, it's not clear how effective they will be, because while they have some 30, 40,000 basic special operations forces, so the equivalent of Green Berets and Navy SEALs that are there. But they also have this mercenary group, the Wagner, military company, which has been known for all kinds of horrendous atrocities in Syria, also in Ukraine, in the Central African Republic, if you follow the news. And then the rest will be made up of conscripts who are badly trained and have low morale. And this might be one Achilles heel for Russia, is that the Russian public may not care much about the spetsnaz, or the special forces, but when you have conscripts coming home dead, they've seen that last on a big scale during Afghanistan. So this is a big risk. Now, there are a couple of things which we need to pay attention to. First of all, and what has caused the immense glee in Moscow is that NATO is not unified, mainly because of one country. And here it's basically Germany has been recalcitrant. The new government has said repeatedly it will not cancel Nord Stream 2, which is the gas pipeline from Russia to Germany, which in the United States has also caused quite a bit of controversy, especially with the Germans lobbying very heavily there to not impose sanctions, with the Republicans in the Senate for sanctions, and the Democrats actually having been for sanctions, but being heavily lobbied by the administration, finally defeated an idea to impose sanctions if Nord Stream 2 goes online. And that's advocated by the Chancellor or Prime Minister, Olaf Scholz. The other issue in terms of sanctions is cutting off SWIFT, which allows dollar transfers. And here the problem is that the Conservative Party, CDU and CSU, or CDU and CSU, their new chairman just said, no, we don't support cutting off SWIFT. So, I mean, those are the two primary things that Germany could do. On top of that, there is the Germans have not been willing to send any kind of weapons to Ukraine, whereas everyone else is. And so that has caused some consternation. And then in my own little country, we're doing three different things. One of them is we're sending 300 Javelins, anti-missile rockets, the best, top of the line, state of the art, to Ukraine, which we initially bought from the United States. And then following international procedure, you have to ask the producer of the weapon that you buy for permission, which was immediately given by the United States. So we're shipping these missiles off, as are other countries that have bought Javelins. But then we have in our country some basically 40-year-old Howitzers, which were initially from the DDR, the former East Germany, which then became property of the reunited Germany, which then they gave or sold to the Finns, who in turn then gave it to us. Now, every step of the way, you have to ask the permission of the German government. And so we wanted to give them these howitzers, Ukraine, these howitzers, and the German government refused, which again has caused lots of waves across NATO. Why would you do that? And then the third thing we actually did was that since we're a highly digital country, a fully digital state-of-the-art military hospital. And now that we could give, and in fact, Germany co-financed that. But there have been other issues. Again, the UK was sending their equivalent of Javelins to Ukraine, but because Germany wouldn't clear transport over their territory, or it would take them 2 weeks to do it, the Germans the Brits simply flew around Germany. Now, if you look at the map, it looks pretty funny because they cross over and then they head north, and then they go through Denmark, and then they fly down through Poland to avoid German airspace. Again, all of which is creating a good deal of doubt in the minds of other allies about the trustworthiness of Germany within NATO. And as I said, this is causing huge glee among well, in the Kremlin. Now, in addition to this situation on the ground, I mean, we have one more big international body there, which is the European Union, which has failed to really do anything with security on the security dimension for as long as it's been around, but especially in the last 10, 12 years, in which there was actually a sort of a call to develop EU security. Now, when the Russians presented their ultimata, they presented them to NATO and they presented them to the United States, and there was no mention of the Europeans, upon which they went fairly ballistic and were bleeding and rending shirts and saying why they don't talk to us, why they're not talking to us. But when, on the other hand, from a Russian perspective, you say, like, why would we talk to the EU when they really are not part of anything that that has anything to do with security? There is, however, something that the Europeans can do, and which so far has been almost completely neglected on the part of countries in Europe, be the EU or not, but Ukraine borders 4 countries in the European Union: Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. On top of that, Ukrainian citizens, of which there are 44 million, have visa-free travel to the European Union. So if you actually end up with a war, and especially with massive civilian casualties and bombing and so forth, you can imagine there will be several million people who will then flee. And where they will flee is Europe, where they can just come across the border with their Ukrainian passports. This would be, I predict, a much larger refugee flow than the 2 million we saw in 2015, where the people who basically came from Syria across the sea, and on arrival had to claim asylum because they were not entering using regular means and legal means. But these people, which could be what? Out of a population of 44 million, it could be 4 million, it could be 7 million, 10 million, who knows? Civilians fleeing with their Ukrainian passports, coming up to the EU border and saying, hi, we're here. And basically they get to cross the border with no problem because they have visa-free travel. I mean, it's exactly the same as an American flying to Paris or London. You go through passport control and then it's like, okay, you're in and you do what you want. So this is something where the EU in turn could actually, or should be doing a lot, and we have not seen much going on, but this is an additional security problem that Europe has failed to think about, because that's something that would, I mean, there's not just a war that is being threatened, but this is like a major disaster that could befall Europe whenever the shooting starts. So that's kind of a tour de table, or sort of roundup of what the situation is. It's fluid, obviously. The Russians continue to be very belligerent and threatening. The only last thing I might mention is, why are they doing this? Well, it seems that Vladimir Putin has for quite a while wanted to restore the former Soviet Union, to make it sort of Russia coterminous with the Soviet Union. And he has been wildly anti-Ukrainian for a long time. I mean, he told President Bush already in 2008 that Ukraine's not a country. He penned a long ethnographic linguistic essay this past summer, arguing that no, Ukrainians they're just speaking a dialect of Russian, which is not true. And basically saying they're, all this talk about Ukraine being a separate country is nonsense. And of course, I mean, Ukrainian is actually, you can argue, it's closer to Polish than it is to Russian, but in any case, this is a serious, I mean, that's the ideological dimension of all of this. And finally, I say one of the things that you will see crop up in the US media and some other places, which is, well, they have this large Russian minority. And as if that's a reason to declare war. The problem with that is that the last 8 years of war have really been the crucible that's created a nation known as Ukrainians. And whether their mother tongue is Russian or if it's Ukrainian, it doesn't really make much of a difference because they are Ukrainians. You see, the armed forces, whether you speak Ukrainian or Russian, people slip back and forth. And the Russian claim that, we have to defend our Russians in Ukraine is equivalent basically to, say, the United Kingdom saying we have to defend English speakers in Ireland, right? Would anyone really believe that, the English speakers, or most of the people in Ireland actually, would then say, oh no, we really want to be with England? No, that's not, we know if you know anything about Ireland, that's not going to work. And so the idea of being, whether you speak Russian or Ukrainian, which are closely related, as I mentioned, really plays no role at this point. Though it is true that the Kremlin is trying to play this card, but doesn't work. So with that, I figured I'd sort of end my quick synopsis of where we are and open up to your questions.
Great, thank you very much for that fascinating and rich overview. There's so much to look at there. Let me start off by talking a little bit about asking a little about the role of history, because you made just a very interesting comment right now about the last 8 years or so being the crucible that has kind of turned Ukraine into a nation, and quite fascinating. Given, I know your understanding of Vladimir Putin, which you've talked about before as someone who's a kind of counter-enlightenment figure who values himself as someone who understands nationalism, understands someone who prides himself obviously on being some kind of a geostrategist. You're one of the few of us unlike us in Washington, you have actually sat down with Vladimir Putin. You obviously know the Russian leadership to a significant degree, both personally and from close observation. What motivates Putin? How could he have such a blind spot with regard to Ukraine? I want to say this, then I want to turn to the West and ask about our blind spots next.
Well, there are two ways to look at it. One is that he's trying to instrumentalize some kind of Russian nationalism that I don't think really at this point is possible to instrumentalize. Clearly in 2014, he used the invasion and occupation of Crimea to stir up a lot of jingoist pro-Putin sentiment among Russians. In the meantime, the Russian economy has stagnated, and the kind of boost that he got 8 years ago, it's unlikely he'll get it now. And if you read even the polls that are, how much you can believe Russian opinion polls, because they're conducted basically under the auspices of the Russian government. But even there is not much support for any kind of war with Ukraine. So that side is not working too well, and it's unlikely that this will cause a huge sort of rebound of support. The other thing is, this is kind of classical, which if you look at sort of Imperial Germany in 1913-14 or Japan in the sort of lead up to Pearl Harbor, there is a sense, it seems, that if they don't do it now, they will fall too far behind. So this is our last chance to make a real grab. And right now we see that the US is divided. And therefore, let's use this opportunity because it is the window of opportunity is closing, just as the Imperial Germany in 1913-14 said, well, if we look at the projections that the Brits will be far ahead of us, and so we better do this now. And the same thing with Japanese thinking was, well, if we don't really stop the US by bombing Pearl Harbor now, the way the US is developing, that it will never be able to do it. And so at least a number of analysts have argued that this is that kind of moment for Russia, which is that, okay, this is a time when the US appears temporarily weak and divided. We are probably at the peak of our abilities, and we have this whole natural gas thing over Europe, over their heads, sort of the sword of Damocles, that this is the time for us to make our move, because in the future, we may not be able to do it. And certainly the rapid development of Ukraine since 2014 plays into this as well, which is that I mentioned that they have been, they're sort of, the nation has been forged through the war of the last 8 years, which I repeat is a war, has been a continuous war with 14,000 dead. It's kind of like, let's put it in the perspective of the Vietnam War. They have basically 1/5 of the population of the United States during the Vietnam War, and they have basically 1/5 of the population, 1/5 of the casualties. So it's basically the psychological effect of the war is fairly similar, but the difference being that they're the ones being attacked, right? So this is that's caused. So, and Ukraine has made huge advances in sort of becoming more market economy, reining in the oligarchs, cleaning up on corruption, all the things that debilitated it for many, many years until basically 2014. The last thing I mentioned is that, right now the big push on Ukraine is that no, they can never join NATO. Well, in fact, there wasn't even a desire for them among Ukrainians to join NATO when the Russians invaded 8 years ago. And where they invaded to intercede was to block Ukraine from developing, from getting something as minor as a quote association agreement with the European Union. And just so that's clear, that's just a free trade agreement. It's not EU membership. It's so far away from EU membership as could possibly be. It's basically a free trade agreement plus student-teacher exchange programs. It's really kind of a very minor thing. We had an association agreement. It took us 10 years to get from our association agreement to joining the EU. And we worked hard as hell for those 10 years. And we don't see any real efforts on the part of the Ukrainians to do that, unfortunately. But the point being that it is, already even having something as minor as an association agreement with the European Union was in the eyes of Vladimir Putin 8 years ago a casus belli. That I'm going to go invade them because they want to have a free trade agreement with the EU. That shows this kind of mentality that unfortunately reigns in the Kremlin.
Yeah, no, very, very interesting. So yeah, it was quite striking. I remember being in Ukraine in 2014 and seeing just an unbelievable number of EU flags. I've never seen as many EU flags anywhere flying on the Maidan.
Not in the EU, certainly.
Yeah, definitely not in the EU, particularly not at that point when there was, Brexit was looming and there was great frustration over the euro and the tensions, over the North and South and the like. Let me ask you about. So it's interesting. The Ukrainians have. Certainly, Putin is who he is. The Ukrainians have certainly strengthened their resolve, but the resolve of the West, although it seems to be strengthening in the last few days, is certainly weak. Do you see, in your presentation, you seem to be skeptical that Putin will be able to back down in the face of all this? Am I right? And do you see any circumstances that he might be able to claim some sort of a Pyrrhic victory and walk off, or is there too much? You mentioned the challenges he faces at home as well.
Well, okay. I mean, there are certain opportunities, at least domestically, because as with, our enemy is East Asia. No, our enemy is Oceania. I mean, he could flip that on a dime. So, I mean, suddenly he would have to claim some kind of victory, but he's gotten one, which I think he may, in fact, use as a way to get out of the corner that he's been painted himself into. Which is that he has quietly, without any opposition, any objection, moved massive amounts of the Russian army with tanks and materiel and everything else, and Air Force into Belarus. And Belarus, in a sense, has just become, I mean, not de jure, but de facto part of Russia. And so, I mean, one way out, I can be, well, okay, we decided to, sort of let the Ukrainians, do their funny little thing there. But in the process, we just increased Russia to include Belarus. And with an acquiescent and pliable dictator, Lukashenko, there wouldn't be any objection. And there wouldn't be much popular. I mean, while the Belarusian population definitely does not want to be part of Russia, given the effectiveness and the brutality of the Belarusian security forces, you won't get demonstrations either. So that could be one way out. But at this point, other than that, I mean, what are you going to say? I mean, because the West is not going to give in. It's not going to do that. I mean, maybe you can claim, okay, we divided the West because Germany is now kind of viewed with suspicion. But I think the initial idea was to really push the US out of Europe, and that's backfired. If anything, sort of the sentiment regarding NATO and regarding the US presence in Europe has become far stronger.
Let's look at the German question in particular, the German problem, we can call it once again. It's quite a challenge. We in Washington, I think a number of us have been frustrated. There's been all this talk about Angela Merkel as the leader of the free world, and my own sense, and I know you were certainly a very vocal critic of President Trump, but in my senses, I think a lot of Americans instinctively agree with President Trump's gut instinct on Germany, which was Germany is a country that benefits immensely from the American security umbrella, while at the same time enjoying close relations with Russia. Obviously, in the past, engaging with Iran when the Iran deal was in effect, and obviously having its auto industry very dependent on China. And there was great hope, I think, among people in Washington that a new government, particularly one with a strong Green Party presence in Berlin, might somehow change Germany's policies, but that has not been the case. And as we look at Western options, we're cruelly tied by Nord Stream 2, by both, first and foremost, by Angela Merkel's decision way back when to shut off her nuclear reactors after Fukushima, and then move really to dependence on Russian natural gas, and her refusal as well to build a natural gas terminal that President Trump had asked her to put in place when Trump left office. And we had a real opportunity, I think, in the Biden administration early on, when the Germans wanted sanctions off Nord Stream 2, to make serious demands on the Germans with regard to Ukraine, with regard to security assistance, development assistance, all sorts of things. No requests were made, in the hope that somehow opening the door to Germany would lead to a much closer transatlantic partnership. And at the end of the day, it's not what we see. What do you make of what's going on in Germany? and also in terms of Germany's sort of strange understanding of history, that it won't allow weapons to be used against Russia, but God forbid, what about the security of the Baltic nations, Poland, and all those other countries that were,
invaded by the Germans.
Exactly, from the Ribbentrop-Molotov agreement. But what's your sense?
Well, first of all, I'd say that the free rider part of that is something that not only annoys. The Germans are sort of struggling to reach devoting 1.5% of GDP to defense, and they're against even raising that. And, we've been doing over 2% since we joined, basically, and so is other countries that may be a little slower, but Europe has in the past 10 years moved up a fair bit in terms of paying attention to doing their share in NATO. So the thing about the US, US sends 4.5, but that also is that the US is also in Asia and in the Middle East. So, but for Europe, the idea is everyone should do 2%. And, people are, Eastern Europe does, France does, okay, they're not in the EU anymore, but the UK does. So, this idea of, we don't want to spend money is not that popular, not only in the United States, but also in the alliance. So that's one part of it. Now, the history part is, I find, and I have actually commented quite critically on this, there's this idea that Germany owes Russia because of World War II. But that would be, I understand. But on the other hand, if you actually look at who were the countries that suffered the most deaths, both in terms of percentage, which was much higher, and in terms of even absolute numbers, they were first and foremost Poland, which, they both occupied and killed people. The Germans came in from one side, the Russians from the other. Russia was, the Soviet Union was for 2 years Germany's ally, right? And they did not suffer as many casualties as the Poles, the Belarusians, and the Ukrainians. And then you get statements, as we heard from the German president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, which apply to things that really shouldn't at all, which is like, we owe Russia the Nord Stream 2 pipeline because of what we did in World War II. And you're going like, what? What are you? Whereas and the whole point of Nord Stream 2 is to kill the gas deliveries via Ukraine, the country that suffered more than Russia. And so this we have a special obligation to Russia has been a dominant theme for years. Add to that the success, admittedly, in the 1970s of Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, which is to get just, things calmed down. We can all agree, or most of us can agree that, well, it was successful given the sort of the tensions of the Cold War period. But this is a legacy policy. It's not working right now. And so this mantra in German, which is Vandal durch Handel, or change through trade. It rhymes in German, right? But change through trade has not been working. And when you look at trade, Poland and the Czech Republic and Slovakia import or buy more things from Germany than Russia does. It's like they're not big countries. Okay, Poland has 40 million, but 8 million Czechs, 6 million Slovaks. They're buying more German stuff. And then you have this, then there's this overall thing about sort of, while claiming morality, this was about a month ago, the chairman of VW, Volkswagen, they have a big car plant in Xinjiang, and which is where the Uyghurs are. And he was really hit hard saying, well, why are you you have slave labor in Xinjiang. And his answer was, well, if we don't have that cheap labor, we won't be able to meet our green targets. And it's like, people say, what? In other words, sort of, we fight climate change by using slave labor. It's not a really, it's a kind, first of all, it couldn't be taken seriously anyway, but this idea of like, it's very mercantile. It's like, what matters is what we can sell abroad. And, if it comes to ethics, morality, we're willing to just sort of play those down or chuck them out the window for selling stuff abroad, which, it's, we've seen it with other countries in the past, but they usually don't try to play the morality card at the same time. You can't do both, frankly.
Sure. And there's also the reverse of the Vandal door Handel, which is the impact on German elites in particular, but also other Western European elites and it's not just former Chancellor Schroeder's with his lead role in Gazprom, how it has really defanged so many in Germany, Hungary, elsewhere, and has posed real challenges to Western unity. Let me ask about. Let me shift gears and ask about President Biden, whom you've obviously known over the years. How would you grade his handling of the situation? It's there's been a lot of speculation that it was the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan that really sent the signal that was kind of a green light that Putin took. As you mentioned earlier, this was a moment to act, an optimal moment. Your thoughts?
Well, there's in foreign policy, there was a survey, and I was one of the 3 people asked on Europe, and I gave him a B-. Starting from, first of all, the huge hopes, because, to be honest, people were afraid that in Europe that President Trump would pull out of NATO, right? So, and then instead you get this sort of, Europe is back, Europe is back. Oh, great, well, now let's see what happens. And then it didn't happen. That was, I think that the Afghanistan withdrawal debacle which was quite shocking at the time, I think did more just regarding the competence of the United States. Sort of like, because otherwise this vision that the US is the, if it's military, the most competent country in the world is the United States, and no one comes close. And then it's kind of like, well, that didn't really work, did it? Too well. So that, I think, was, yes, that played a role, but though not as much as, you see sort of the opposition in the United States saying, oh, that destroyed everything. Well, it didn't in Europe, but it just made people think about, well, not that great. But the sort of failure to follow up on the US is back. It just didn't really materialize. And certainly certain moves such as first sort of taking, taking Angela Merkel at her word that, well, we'll let you do Nord Stream 2, but but if the Russians do something, then we won't do it. Then the Russians started doing stuff, and Germany didn't do anything. And then on top of that, sort of the German administration joint efforts to prevent a veto, or rather, prevent the sanctions that were proposed by the Republicans in the Senate that did also have broad support on the Democratic side of the aisle, which then through efficient lobbying on the part of the administration and the Germans managed to kill those sanctions. So, you look at that and okay, maybe Germany was happy, but the rest of us looked at it and said, that wasn't that great, right? So that's why I gave it B-, because it was like expectations were huge. The rhetoric was, like, at the Munich Security Conference, like, Europe is back. And it wasn't. US is back, sorry. US is back, but it wasn't really.
Is your sense is it a lack of strategic vision? Is it naivete and trust in the Russians? Is it interest in the Germans? Was it a focus on Asia? Was it just do you have a sense that President Biden has a strategic vision deep down?
I think it's the last one. I think it was the hope was to really fixate on China and get that in order and put all of the US's sort of security resources to dealing with the China challenge. And you can see like the kind of things that were written by people considered close to the administration. Like, well, we shouldn't really deal with Ukraine, or we should get the Russians what the, and you read that and you realize, okay, this is like, again, someone close to the administration. What is this going on? It was, viewed as a various trial balloons to see how the public would react to caving into the Russians on Ukraine. I mean, I think that's now gone, because that met with considerable opposition on the Hill and by both sides of the aisle. But I think that was primarily it, is the idea that we're going to now focus on the problem of China. And I mean, again, this goes back to sort of Putin very effectively sort of saying, oh, this is my chance to really, the US is not going to get involved and I'll use this opportunity. Well, the US was forced to get involved in a big way. And I think that's where that's how we got to where we are. But I mean, I would say that, well, it's not as easy as you think to say, okay, well, now we'll just focus on Asia and forget Europe. I mean, and Europe also has to realize that this is inevitable, because already during the Obama administration, we had the pivot to Asia, so-called pivot to Asia, which kind of led to not so great results with lack of attention to the 2014 invasion, right? I mean, it didn't really get the full thrust of US attention. And sanctions were not that strong, and there was little sort of efforts on the part of, like the US efforts to corral the cats in Europe didn't really bring too big results. And then you had the Trump administration, which was already going like, we don't want to deal with these Europeans who are not paying their share, even though they had been doing much more. And so it's actually a longer tradition. It goes back to, what is it? It's 14 years since the Obama, or 13 years since the Obama administration came in. So, I think Europeans need to understand that the challenges faced by the United States are not first and foremost in Europe the way they were during the Cold War, and that Europe does need now to carry a lot more water than it has, and there is that awareness is not seeped in everywhere, right? I mean, if you had 400,000 US troops with boots on the ground in Germany alone, I mean, that's the main place, but you had 400,000 protecting Germany. I mean, there are two things that come out of that. One is that, well, maybe you should spend more money on defense now that you don't have all of those Americans here. And secondly, it also, then it colors the rest of everyone's attitude in Europe, which is like, come on, guys, you had 400,000 American troops, and now you're saying, well, we're for peace. We don't really believe in, arming countries. And like, yeah, you didn't have to, because you were guarded by another country. We're not.
And when President Trump made the decision to pull troops out of Germany and send them further east, which I would argue in some ways definitely made a lot of strategic sense in terms of where the actual threats were to NATO. The Germans went crazy and absolutely demanded from the Biden administration that these troops be sent back. So for their own security, they want us, but the concern has been disappointing, I'd argue, from the new government in Germany and from the last one. Let me ask you. Let's wrap up with two last questions. One is about the Brits, and it's been a surprising thing. There's obviously huge chaos in in Boris Johnson's government with Partygate and the like. But it's been quite striking, both how they have taken, in a sense, the international lead, I'd argue, among the Western allies, and how Keir Starmer and the Labour Party has stood shoulder to shoulder with Boris Johnson. And it's get your thoughts on Britain, its absence from the EU, it's how it understands its strategic role. Why is it so different from Germany?
Well, clearly, the UK can get, I mean, sort of re-emphasizes and brings back into focus the fact that, which was been claimed by Brexit all the time, is that, well, we're not in the European Union, but we have not left Europe. And that European security is something that's very important to us. And that's the case. I mean, this is, I mean, the efforts that have been made by the UK in this regard are huge, and has won kudos from everybody around. I mean, everybody says, wow, look at the Brits. They really, I mean, it's not just rhetoric. When they say that we left the EU, but not Europe, and Europe is of primary concern to us, and then they do what they do. I would recommend a piece written last week by Ben Wallace, the defense minister. I think it was in The Guardian, but it was one of the British papers. A fantastic essay, the kind of essay that you don't find written by defense ministers almost anywhere. And this was clearly his own thinking. And as I found out from various sources, that in fact he had written it and then he published it, sort of on why we need to defend Ukraine. And you read it and you go, wow, this is the kind of moral clarity and good writing that, it's not the boilerplate that you always got to get from secretaries and ministers in whatever country. This was great. So you read that. That's like, it was a real eye-opener for me, and certainly in such stark contrast to what's happening domestically in the UK, which I'm not going to comment, but it really looked like a total mess to me.
Yeah, let me wind down the Wallace piece, which I also read, is an absolutely extraordinary piece, and well worth the read. Let's wind up by asking you about Baltic security. It's obvious, all of a sudden, the Baltic nations kind of find themselves again in sort of a vice, surrounded obviously by Russia. Now Belarus, with its growing alliance and partnership, and beyond that, as you mentioned earlier. And lastly, the question of Kaliningrad and the like, and your security is now at risk in some ways, much more so than it was, and could be, depending on what happens in Ukraine. What do the Baltic leaders do? How do you move forward?
Yeah. The Baltic states have been fairly outspoken, if you noticed. I mean, the thing to understand, the difference between Ukraine and the three Baltic countries, that we are in NATO and Ukraine is not. And that comes down to Article 5. So, and that's the whole point of deterrence. You could say, okay, look at the three little countries, and they're, they could be invaded, and 48 hours. Well, the problem that with people who talk about that ignore the fact that if you invade, say, little Estonia, as we're called, tiny Estonia is invaded, and but the country that if Russia invades, they've just made Omsk, Tomsk, and Atomsk, to use Nabokov's expression. You make Omsk, Tomsk, and Atomsk all targets. So, that's the whole idea of collective security, collective defense. And so we're not that worried. Now, actually, to me, the most interesting thing is that the threats that Russia made on the 26th of December, it's my birthday, that's why I remember the date, but against Finland and Sweden have actually nudged the discussion there quite heavily. To the point where the Finnish president on New Year's Day gave a speech, quoting Henry Kissinger, among other people, saying that we reserve the right to make our own decisions on our security. And in the case of Sweden, because there had been threats made to Gotland, the island, which is considered the aircraft carrier in the Baltic, which they had completely, I mean, basically abandoned, pulled all their troops out of there. There was nothing there. It's kind of a nice tourist destination, medieval city and all that town. It's not even a city. Well, they pulled out of the out of Mali, where they had special forces, and they brought the special forces to Gotland. They brought in all kinds of armor, all because the Russians were talking about, oh, well, we'll just take Gotland. And if you actually, Gotland is so strategic because with the SS-300 and 400 missiles, if someone if you take that over and you use the existing Russian missiles, from Gotland, you can hit every capital in Northern Europe. I mean, if you just do it, Stockholm, obviously, but Oslo, Copenhagen, Berlin, Warsaw, Vilnius, Riga, Tallinn, and Helsinki. So you've got everybody in Northern Europe is all within range. And so there even been talks on Russian TV. Oh, we'll just go take Gotland. Well, this has nudged these two countries that have been neutral for decades. Well, in the case of Sweden, 200 years. But neutrality somehow doesn't seem like that good an option when you have Russia threatening you. So. And there have been all kinds of funny things with all kinds of assault landing ships floating around Gotland, mock bombing raids on Stockholm over the years. And now with the rhetoric increasing on very strange flights also. I mean, I mean, you can look it up. I mean, basically reconnaissance flights passing over air command in Finland and other things. So, I mean, this kind of braggadocio on the part of the Russian political leadership and the kind of military actions are not things that really endear them to countries. And the latest thing, this is why I don't understand what they're doing it with neutral countries, is that they're now announced yesterday, they're doing live fire exercises in the exclusive economic zone of Ireland. And I was going, what are they doing there? Until this morning, there was a map of the transatlantic cables. And there's like this choke point where they all come together between, the East coast of the US and Europe and the UK. There's one place where all of these cables are in one place. And that's exactly where they're doing the live fire exercises. So even the Irish are going, what is this? So.
Well, on that note, look, it's been absolutely fascinating. We could have gone on for hours. Didn't delve into, there are a number of issues on the cyber side and other things, but we're out of time. I just want to really thank you, President Ilves. It's always an honor to be with you. And your incredibly insightful remarks are very helpful to those of us in the United States trying to figure out next steps. So I want to thank you for your time, for your insights, and look forward to welcoming you back in person at Hudson Institute when travel picks up again. But thank you so very much.
And give my regards to my various friends at Hudson who haven't seen in a long, long time, unfortunately.
With great pleasure. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you.